very warm welcome to the latest episode in Let's Talk Decarbonisation. My name's Matt Stadlen, and I'm absolutely thrilled today to introduce to you Andy Samuel. He's the CEO of North Sea Transition Authority, the North Sea Transition Authority, once, of course, called the Oil and Gas Authority. Andy, really brilliant to have you on the series today. May I just start by asking you a big picture question. In your considered view, as someone who has been working intimately with energy and specifically in fossil fuels, and from within government, I suppose, do you think that the world is heading for a climate disaster?
Yes, and it's hugely concerning. We've been talking about the climate emergency for the last 3 years. I think Greta Thunberg did an amazing job raising consciousness, and it's no longer just a kind of long-term thing. We're seeing it with the increasing frequency of climate events, and the massive dislocations already happening, and I think the reality of crossing some looming tipping points is petrifying, actually. I wrote a blog a couple of weeks ago when I think both the Arctic and the Antarctic were 30 and 40 degrees above normal. I mean, that is very, very worrying. And as a geologist who's looked at the kind of long-term history of the planet and mass extinctions and deep affinity with nature and the environment, which most geologists have, and then to see what's happening now at such a rapid rate, this is the biggest thing that we all need to solve, and of course the read across to biodiversity or loss of biodiversity and the amplifying of social injustice. But the good news is that whilst it's terrifying, I think it can be solved. But as many people have said, this is the decade of action. It has to be.
It's still very difficult to explain to people in language that we all understand what climate catastrophe looks like. So if we get this decade wrong and we do head for disaster, what does that disaster mean for people who live in New York, people who live in Beijing or London or on the African West Coast?
Better experts than me, but what I read from the experts, and I think the IPCC report, is the latest. It's very unjust in that it's going to impact probably people who've had the least, cause behind it more. So, sub-Saharan Africa, just massive droughts, huge loss of crops, more and more fires. And with that's going to be huge social dislocation. I think in the more developed countries, ultimately, if we don't solve this, large cities are going to be underwater. I mean, this is very serious, and for me, it comes back to those tipping points. And despite the best science, I think no one really knows. And I'm used to the precautionary principle, where one doesn't play with such massive risks lightly.
You mentioned the IPCC report, so that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and they brought out their latest big report this week. Today, as we're speaking, the government launched its climate strategy, or rather its energy strategy. We'll come to that, but I just want to pick out a couple of things from this report and get your reaction to them. So it's from the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, and he talked about this report being a litany of broken climate promises by governments and corporations. He said it's a file of shame cataloguing the empty pledges that put us firmly on track toward an unlivable world. And he said something else important as well. He said high-emitting governments and corporations are not just turning a blind eye, they are adding fuel to the flames. He said, investing in new fossil fuel infrastructure is moral and economic madness. And the reason I want to bring that to your attention is partly, of course, because you are the CEO of what was called the Oil and Gas Authority in the United Kingdom, but also because as part of the government's energy strategy that I just talked about, it does involve trying to find more gas and oil in our North Sea reserves. Can those two facts, what the UN Secretary General said and what our government intends to do in the years ahead, can they be in any way reconciled?
So the UN Secretary General is speaking, with a kind of global remit, and I can't speak for all the broken pledges across, countries across the globe. Um, there are different views on how successful or not COP26 was, but I think, if latest events aren't a wake up call, God help us, and people do need to stick to their pledges going forward. In the UK, I think to give some credit to the UK government, this strong commitment to net zero 2050, and everything that comes with that, setting up of excellent organisations like the Climate Change Committee, who hold government and everyone to account, is a very good step forward. For me, it's all about delivery. Back in 2020, I took to my board serious propositions about how we would ourselves reconcile the energy trilemma, which you've effectively referred to, and we put net zero into the heart of our strategy, alongside the ongoing economic extraction of oil and gas. We've now gone further, and part of our thinking behind becoming the North Sea Transition Authority is to signal very clearly this is all about transition. And we did a detailed study started actually in 2018, and we published it in 2020, that actually highlighted that the North Sea is the jewel in the crown actually in providing the UK solution, and could provide 60% of the carbon abatement required out to 2050. 30% of that is through electrifying the platforms already out there. And by the way, that's also important for carbon storage, which I'd like to talk about. Within that 30% is also carbon storage and blue hydrogen. And then, of course, the other 30%, which probably is already growing, is the rest of offshore wind. So we see the North Sea and the skills and many of the players as vital to accelerate that transition. I was really pleased today, and I don't think it's been picked up by many, but in the strategy that came out today, which is, to be fair to government, is the energy supply strategy. So it's not all encompassing energy, it's particularly focused on security of supply. But within there was the recognition we should actually reduce demand of gas by 40% by 2030. And I really welcome that, because, and my chairman and I have been saying quite a while now, actually the real question should be about reducing demand as quickly as possible. But no one's going to thank anyone if actually the taps are turned off. We saw with recent power outages how uncomfortable modern day life is without energy. We experienced this in North Devon with Storm Arwen, and I think energy is a public good and shouldn't be taken completely for granted. But it is all about accelerating this transition, and it can be done. And our analysis shows that UK oil and gas has a relatively low carbon footprint. Norwegian gas is the best, and we're lucky we've got pretty good connection. And I spent half a day last week with the Norwegian Petroleum Directorate and the Ministry, exploring what more we can learn together. But beyond that, actually, it doesn't make sense to import LNG with 3 times the footprint when we've got lower carbon footprint on our doorstep.
Just a very brief, straightforward question. Is discovering more oil and gas, developing new oil and gas fields, compatible with moving towards net zero by 2050?
In the UK context, currently it is, and I'll explain why. And hopefully this will be confirmed in the government's climate compatibility checkpoint. So just to be clear, there won't be a green light for any further licensing rounds if they're not consistent with the climate compatibility checkpoint. And that's very much addressed to ensure that that question is answered. But at the moment, we've got a growing gap between what the UK actually demands and what it actually can supply from the North Sea. So just to be clear, the North Sea is declining. So when the UN Secretary General, I think he's talking about growing, the North Sea is rapidly declining, and the gap, therefore, in the security supply crunch only grows. So in that context, small fields around existing infrastructure that have low carbon footprint actually are compatible, and that's consistent with the Climate Change Committee's analysis. We're not talking here opening up huge new provinces or very large discoveries. That is not what the North Sea or the West of Shetlands can offer. This is very much incremental around existing hubs. I would go further. And again, to be fair to the current investors, they want to do the right thing, which involves electrifying the current hubs and actually getting them ready for carbon storage and ultimately hydrogen. And they look at it as an integrated business, but they need certainty that there is a kind of investment case for all of this going forward.
What does electrifying those hubs mean?
So this is we actually had a round table with investors and the prime minister, and he actually asked that very question, and in his own language, then once he'd kind of understood it, called it clean power for rigs, which actually I thought was a good description. So at the moment, 70% of the emissions involved in actually producing the oil and gas is actually through diesel power generation to power these platforms, which is often done with diesel or gas. Actually, there's a growing recognition that with the growing offshore wind industry, and as we look at floating offshore wind, we can actually put that adjacent to some of these installations and actually provide clean power, effectively decarbonising the ongoing operation. And that will save 3 to 4 megatons per year, which is substantial. And every bit helps in this fight against the climate emergency.
When you say, Andy, that the North Sea is actually declining, do you mean that the reserves are literally declining, or that our reliance on them as part of our energy map, our energy usage, is declining?
The reserves are literally declining. Even if one wanted to, it would be almost impossible to hold production flat. In all forecasts, it's quite a rapid decline. That's just the reality, and that's not the case in many other oil and gas provinces around the world. Just to add to that, so I haven't fully digested the 3,000 pages, obviously, of the IPCC report. My team are going through that at the moment. We did fully analyse the IEA report, which made a similar no new developments, and the UNEP report. And we looked at the decline rate of the North Sea relative to what they were calling for, and we're declining quicker. So if all other basins were like the North Sea, there would be no problem, in other words. Now, we recognise that's not the case. And I'm also conscious that the UK, since the Industrial Revolution, has more than had its fair share of historical emissions, and there is a question of equity. And actually, what I think is really required is perhaps less reports and more dialogue, where you've got to get all the oil and gas producing nations together and come up with a plan. So in the UK, we have a plan. It's called the North Sea Transition Deal. Again, not talked about enough. But in that deal, industry have committed to halving their emissions by 2030. And I don't know any other basin that's done that. And they've also committed to investing 16 billion in carbon capture, hydrogen, and the clean power to rigs that we've just been talking about. And we are holding them to account on that.
So, as a government body, a sort of government company, actually, you're arguing that you would say quite strongly that any suspicion I might have had that in March it was renaming what was the Oil and Gas Authority as the North Sea Transition Authority, that's not an attempt to pull the wool over all of our eyes.
No, what would I say? But all I can say is we're authentic. I've got a really good leadership team. I'm actually happy to meet. I saw you did a brilliant one of these interviews with George Monbiot, who I've seen talk live, have had huge respect for over the years. He, of course, tweeted his derision. I would actually like to sit down and talk with George and actually have this kind of conversation, because we're actually a purpose-driven organization, and our purpose is very much twofold: security of supply, but absolutely accelerating that move to net zero. And we're attracting talent because they get it and they want to make a difference. And actually, we can change from within. And through this, we also generate economic prosperity, because some of the things I've been talking about are brilliant opportunities for the broader supply chain. Floating offshore wind is an area where the skills of the oil and gas industry can be directly transferred across. And this is a technology that's going to be needed across the world. I would say exactly the same for carbon storage. So that people have a real purpose here in helping. The one area where I see alignment across most people is everyone agrees we need a just transition, but people don't talk enough about the detail of that. What we want to avoid, and my chairman's got experience of this, he was the energy minister as coal was shut down and saw firsthand the impact that had on communities. So there is something here where a well thought through master plan done at pace can actually really kind of deliver the everything we're looking for to solve this energy trilemma. But I'm not saying it's easy. What I do feel, though, is that the heavily polarized debate doesn't always help. I think it's absolutely right that there's a challenge, but at some point, I think people need to come together, recognize this is not as straightforward as anyone would like, and actually we've got to move forward.
I suppose without the Greta Thunbergs of this world, without arguably Extinction Rebellion and so forth, it's much harder for news organisations to get people talking about the climate or to cover the climate so that we do end up talking about it. So even though they might come out with polarising views, which many would argue are actually right, whether or not they're right in their entirety, at least they're forcing us all to have a conversation. May I just ask you, Andy, exactly what it is, in synthesis, what it is that the North Sea Transition Authority does, and why you decided to take up the role of CEO. I know you're leaving at the end of this year.
So I that will be me having done 8 years. I was originally appointed for 3, extended twice, and it was longer than I thought. But what kept me wanting to do it beyond the original term was actually this move into incorporating net zero, because hopefully you can pick up that that's very important to me. And it made the whole job more complex, but actually a lot more purposeful at the same time. But officially, we manage the oil and gas licenses offshore, steward the ongoing production, the economic prosperity that comes with that, and also the carbon storage licenses. And if we may, I'd like to kind of maybe just share a bit about what we're doing on that, because there's been a lot of talk about new oil and gas licenses. But next month, I'm actually going to be launching our very first carbon storage round. We've issued 4 licenses already, but as single licenses, I'll be issuing a couple more. But given the huge interest that we've picked up from investors and the huge potential that my geologists have mapped across the North Sea, 78 gigatons of storage potential, now feels the right time to get on with getting more licenses into the right hands. The government target in the net zero strategy was upped from the 10-point plan to 20 to 30 megatons per year by 2030. So if you work backwards, we've really got to get a move on. So very excited by the growing interest. I actually had a meeting this morning with one of the key industrial players who believes that very shortly there will be no subsidies required. The cost of carbon will make actually carbon storage a commercially viable option. So I think we're going to see a lot of activity the next few years there. So that's an example of some of the new work we're doing that we weren't doing when I started back in 2015.
You mentioned communities and how they suffered when coalfields were shut down. Is work actively going on now to ensure that when we as a country do finally transition, if we do transition away from oil and gas in the North Sea, that the people whose expertise have enabled that are able then to move across to fully green jobs, working with solar, working with wind, and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, look, the good news is it's happening already, but there's a lot more to do. So 90% of the jobs historically in the oil and gas industry have been in what one calls the supply chain. So that's different to the operators. The operators, everyone will be familiar with BP, Shell, those kind of companies. The supply chain actually do most of the work. This is companies like Wood Group, Aker, Technip. They've actually already moved across into offshore energy more broadly rather than just oil and gas over the last few years. A company like Wood, used to be 100% oil and gas. I think it's now only 25%. So they've very skillfully seen the future and positioned themselves well. But there's a lot more to do. So I chair the North Sea Transition Forum that brings together, we've been doing this for quite a few years, brings together a number of task forces, including a supply chain and exports task force that looks very much at skills. So John McDonald, who is the chief exec of Opito, has been tasked with actually coming up with an offshore passport that allows people to transfer between the different offshore energies without having to recertify, retrain, because actually working, there are some differences, but if you're a rigger, doing rigging on an offshore platform versus an offshore wind farm is essentially the same kind of task. So they shouldn't have to spend £5,000, £10,000 going through, bureaucratic retraining when they don't need it. So things are happening like that to facilitate that. I'm also on the board of the Energy Transition Zone based up in the northeast of Scotland, which is an economic agency very much looking at helping communities like Aberdeen transition off oil and gas. So we're looking that we're forming the Floating Offshore Wind Innovation Centre. We're forming the kind of hydrogen coast vision all the way from Orkney through Aberdeenshire, Peterhead, down south. Hydrogen, we could talk about at length. I gave a talk at the Economist Sustainability Week, but it is really exciting. And again, the offshore and onshore oil and gas skills are directly applicable to hydrogen. It's just another gas with some different properties, but this is an industry that's good at dealing with gas.
Notwithstanding what you've said so far, there's still going to be those who'd be surprised to learn that someone whose core role really is to give out licenses to discover gas and oil and so forth in the North Sea is actually so personally concerned about the environment. And you, I think, where you live, are involved in a rewilding process.
Yeah, yeah. So I guess my personal passion has helped kind of accelerate the change within the old oil and gas authority to the North Sea Transition Authority. Um, I don't know. I think as you start to think what's really important, the environment, it always comes up incredibly high for me. And I've been lucky. My wife has been essentially a kind of into ecology, and I think shares a passion with you for birds and just nature for years, and it kind of rubs off. And we formed a joint kind of vision to get a bit of land and try and give a bit back. So we were very lucky actually in 2020 to come across a farm in North Devon on the coast that's been a bit rundown that we were able to purchase and move to, and we're working with the brilliant farmer who's farmed it for many years to actually rewild it essentially, but in a managed way. So we're in the North Devon biosphere, and they put us on to some excellent ecologists who've done a baseline assessment. We've already planted, I think, 1,600 trees. The next phase will be wildflower meadows and wetlands and a whole variety of different habitats. So it's not just a case of just letting it go. That would just end up kind of bracken and brambles. It's actually managing for biodiversity gain. Really exciting. It's nice to learn about something new, and as part of it, we're also looking to create a kind of nature centre, convert an old barn into a teaching centre, work with the North Devon biosphere, and also really kind of champion renewables. We've got a wind turbine on the land, and we're looking at heat pumps and solar and all of that, which is, again, a learning curve for us.
We're running out of time, but just to bring it back to gas and oil, you'll correct me, I hope, if I'm wrong, but looking at the government's energy strategy launched today, it seems to me that the government has said that we may be using a quarter of the gas in 2050 that we are today. In other words, that we would still, and that may apply to oil as well, I'm not sure, that we would still be using gas in 2050, which is the point at which we're expected to be, we've pledged to be, we've committed to be net zero. Can you explain to people who might not understand how that's possible?
Yeah, so I think the government's conscious that, for example, it's a big challenge to get everything electrified and solving the kind of intermittency type issues. So gas may still have a role, for example, in clean power generation. How is that clean? You have to couple it with carbon storage. So yes, you're using the gas, but you're then storing the emissions back in the North Sea where it came from. So it's almost like a circular closed loop. So I think that's an example. Some industries may still require some gas. Oil is still used for feedstock. If it's purely for feedstock and not combusted, then that doesn't add to the climate emergency. But it would be great if actually by 2050 it's far less than 25%. But I think and part of the climate compatibility checkpoint should actually be flexible to how things change over time.
I understand your personal commitment to making the world a better place. The first answer you gave us was so stark. And given that, aren't we to conclude, despite everything that we've talked about and what you've helped me to understand in the last half an hour, aren't we in this country, though we may be going faster than many other countries, aren't we still simply going too slow when, as you say, this is the key decade?
I'm very lucky that I get to have these type of conversations with a range of stakeholders. I really enjoy my conversations with the Climate Change Committee. And, I think we collectively recognize some of this stuff is very nuanced and it's quite hard to get across and it's quite complex. And actually, we need to show global leadership. And there it gets quite tricky because whilst we can do a lot in the UK, that's not going to solve it. This is a global issue. And what are we doing? And, COP26, I watched it live, the end and some of the twists and turns and the machinations and prevarications. There's a lot to do globally. I therefore focus on the bits we can do. I think carbon storage, there are skeptics, but most experts, and I think the IPCC report now has moved stronger. So let's get that done really quickly because that can help the whole globe. The offshore wind story is fantastic. Many of the companies that were very focused on oil and gas are now incredibly focused on the offshore wind. So I guess I'm just focusing on the things that I think can really make a difference across the globe where I can. And I think that can be our gift to the world, and then we need to roll it out as quickly as we can.
We haven't mentioned the word nuclear, and I'm just interested in the role that you see. I know it's possibly outside your expertise, the role you see for nuclear, because the government has been clear in this strategy. It wants more nuclear power plants. And whether you think there are inevitable conflicts here as we try to move towards net zero, there'll be those who say that nuclear is too dangerous, and yet it may be a necessary component of our energy future. There are those like me who are fiercely opposed to wind farms on land, onshore wind farms, because and not everyone agrees with me by any means, but I happen to think that they come close to ruining landscapes. And so ideally, I'd rather they didn't have to be part of our energy future. So there are real clashes here. How do we find our way through that forest?
Something I wish was used a bit more. Again, something I think has been very powerful are the citizen assemblies. So both the UK and Scottish government ran them. I think the Climate Change Committee helped with the UK one, for example, and they had people like David Attenborough, Chris Stark, but a whole range of other experts. And I think that's a really good way of actually, with a kind of representation of the population, having these difficult debates, looking at the trade-offs and then collectively coming up with some views, because I imagine the government's looked at issues like the intermittency and nuclear is important. Now, other people may say, well, hydrogen is going to come through as a storage vector and can solve that, but I don't know. The devil is in the detail, and I think there has to be a margin. None of these technologies come without issues. Nothing's completely clean, and we all know wind farms offshore. You still got to mine the various metals, and you know, and batteries have a whole bunch of issues, and so I think it's understanding the entire supply chain, all the trade-offs, and having an honest conversation, and then saying, as a society, what do we really want, and but not trivialize the trade-offs, because this is difficult, and so for me it needs that master plan, but it's going to have to be adaptive as well, because we can't plan out to 2050 with certainty. This is a complex transition.
We're talking in the middle of a cost of living crisis, with gas bills having shot through the roof and possibly going to do the same again in October. Do you see anything in this government strategy for energy supply that suggests in the short term that can ease some of the pain of these costs? And do you think it is actually a longer term initiative? And there's nothing bad about planning for the long term. We don't do enough of that in our politics, I don't think.
Yeah, I mean, I think the government's obviously very aware of the affordability, and I think has done a bit ahead of the strategy. Again, I'm not an expert, but I think the new system operator optimizing will be helpful. But I think you're right. In the short term, I didn't read anything particularly new. I think for the long term, absolutely, because I'm a big fan of renewables, and I think we consistently see that the cost goes down quicker than people forecast, and I don't see any reason why that trend shouldn't continue. So, and maybe it's not even long term. I hope it's midterm, but very short term. And I think thinking next October, I think this should be a concern to all of us.
Before I ask you just to sum up with your message for everyone, final question on gas and oil. Do you think that we could and should? I know it's a difficult question for you, given you are part of the government, but in your heart of hearts, do you think we could and should stop right now as a country? You can't speak for the rest of the world, but you can if you wish. But should we actually stop right now with gas and oil and say, no, this far, no further, we have to find alternative ways to keep ourselves warm and to keep ourselves mobile?
No, I think the government and industry work well together on the North Sea transition deal, and I think the commitment to halve emissions by 2030 is the right one. I think we should be completely clear that that's non-negotiable, because I can imagine there might be some pressure to relax that. No. So I think holding firm to what was a challenging commitment is the right thing. But through that, we need to knock down barriers to anything that will slow down the transition and actually work to accelerate it. But many of the investors I work with actually just see more and more opportunity with the new technologies, with the transition. So I think it's better to go with that energy and get on with it.
Final question then, as I say, just what's your message to all of us?
So I think this is a complex transition. I think if we can find a better way of working together, and that doesn't mean that that they're easy conversations. And I've already said I'm a big fan of Greta, and I think there's an important role. But I'm more into these citizens' assemblies. Everyone actually, it may be a bit messy. It may take a little bit longer in the short term, but work through the trade-offs and come up with a plan. Ideally, that would be kind of cross-party, locked in for the kind of medium to long term. And then it's all about delivery. And we need to deliver at pace now and show global leadership.
Andy Samuel, it was fascinating speaking to you. Thank you so much for joining us in the Let's Talk Decarbonisation series.
Thank you very much.